Have you ever sat quietly in a room and tried to honestly imagine what your life will look like in 5 years? Not the optimistic version you present to others at dinner parties, not the vague reassurance you repeat to yourself when anxiety creeps in at 2 in the morning, but the honest version. The version where you factor in everything you have been reading, everything you have been watching, every conversation you have had with people who work in technology, in finance, in medicine, in law. The version where you allow yourself to follow the trajectory of what is actually happening rather than what you hope is happening. If you have done this honestly, even once, you already know that something is coming. Not slowly, not gradually, not in the comfortable, manageable way that previous technological revolutions unfolded across generations. Something is coming fast. Something is coming at a speed that human civilization has never experienced before. And the year that many of the world's most serious researchers, economists, and technologists keep returning to, the year that appears again and again in the models, in the projections, in the quiet conversations happening in the most advanced research laboratories on Earth, is 2030. Not 2050. Not 2100. Not some distant, abstract future that your grandchildren will have to navigate while you watch from comfortable retirement. 2030. 5 years from now. Close enough that the children who are currently in primary school will still be in their early teens. Close enough that the career you are building right now, the skills you are developing, the professional identity you are investing years of your life into constructing, will still be very much in progress when that year arrives. And the question that should be keeping you awake at night, the question that most people are desperately avoiding because its implications are too destabilizing to sit with, is this. What will be left for you to do? This is not a hypothetical question. It is not science fiction. It is not the paranoid fantasy of technologists who have spent too much time reading dystopian novels. It is the logical conclusion of trends that are already visible, already measurable, already reshaping industries and professions and institutions at a pace that would have seemed impossible as recently as 3 years ago. And understanding what is actually coming, not the sanitized version that corporations feed you to keep you calm and consuming, but the real version. The version that emerges when you examine the data honestly and follow it wherever it leads, is the most important intellectual exercise you can undertake right now. Because the year 2030 is not simply a date on a calendar. It is a threshold. And on the other side of that threshold, the rules of human civilization, the rules about what makes a person valuable, what makes a skill worth developing, what makes an education worth pursuing, what makes a career worth building, may be different in ways that none of our existing frameworks are equipped to process. To understand why 2030 specifically, you need to understand something about the nature of exponential growth that the human brain is fundamentally not designed to intuit. Our minds evolved to track linear change. When our ancestors watched the seasons shift, when they observed animals migrating, when they tracked the gradual changes in their environment, the patterns they needed to recognize were gradual, proportional, predictable. A change that doubled in speed once was unusual. A change that doubled in speed repeatedly, each doubling shorter than the last, was essentially incomprehensible in evolutionary terms. And yet this is precisely the pattern that defines the development of artificial intelligence. Consider what has happened in the last decade alone. In 2012, an artificial neural network achieved a breakthrough in image recognition that the scientific community had expected might take another decade to reach. In 2016, a system defeated the world champion at Go, a game so complex that experts had long argued it would require genuine human-like intuition to master at the highest level. In 2020, a language model demonstrated the ability to write coherent, contextually appropriate text across an enormous range of topics and styles at a level that no serious researcher had predicted was imminent. In 2022, image generation systems began producing visual art of a quality that required years of training for human artists to approach. In 2023 and 2024, AI systems began passing professional licensing examinations in medicine, law, and finance. In 2025, systems began demonstrating the ability to conduct original scientific research, generating hypotheses, designing experiments, and interpreting results in domains from materials, science, to drug discovery. Each of these developments came earlier than predicted, Each of them exceeded the expectations of experts who had spent their careers in the relevant fields. And each of them was followed not by a plateau, as previous technological breakthroughs often were, but by an acceleration. The curve is not flattening. It is steepening. And when you project that steepening curve forward, even conservatively, even accounting for the real obstacles and technical challenges that remain, 2030 is where the lines converge in ways that should demand your full and undivided attention. By 2030, according to projections from research institutions that have no financial incentive to exaggerate, artificial intelligence systems are expected to match or exceed average human performance across virtually every cognitive domain that can be clearly defined and measured, not in one or two narrow fields, not in specialized tasks requiring enormous datasets and carefully controlled conditions. Across the broad, messy, context-dependent landscape of real-world cognitive work that currently employs the majority of educated people in developed economies. Think about what this means concretely, not in abstract economic terms, but in the specific texture of individual lives. If you are a lawyer, consider that AI systems are already outperforming junior associates at contract review, legal research, and case precedent analysis. By 2030, the systems will be writing arguments, conducting discovery, predicting case outcomes, and advising clients with a level of accuracy and comprehensiveness that will make it genuinely difficult for most clients to justify paying for a human attorney's time when an AI can do the same work faster, cheaper, and with access to a knowledge base that no individual human could accumulate in multiple lifetimes. If you are a doctor, consider that AI diagnostic systems are already matching or exceeding specialist-level performance in radiology, dermatology, ophthalmology, and pathology. By 2030, the systems will be integrating genomic data, real-time patient monitoring, global epidemiological patterns, and the entire published literature of medicine simultaneously, producing diagnoses and treatment recommendations that will make the unaided human physician something closer to a quality control checkpoint than a primary source of medical intelligence. If you are a software engineer, the field that until recently felt like the safest possible investment of intellectual capital precisely because it was the profession most directly involved in building the tools of automation, consider that AI systems are already generating functional code from natural language descriptions, debugging complex systems, and architecting software solutions. By 2030, the gap between what an AI system can produce in software development and what a human developer can produce may be comparable to the gap between a calculator and a human mathematician doing arithmetic by hand. The human is not wrong to do it, but the comparison is no longer interesting. If you are a teacher, an architect, a financial analyst, a journalist, a graphic designer, a translator, a therapist, or a researcher in any field where the primary output is cognitive rather than purely physical, the trajectory is the same. By 2030, an AI system will be able to do most of what you do, faster than you can do it, more consistently than you can do it, and at a cost that will make human labor in your field increasingly difficult to justify on purely economic grounds. I know this is uncomfortable. I know that every instinct in you is searching right now for the caveat, the reassurance, the historical parallel that makes this less alarming than it sounds. Perhaps you are thinking of the Industrial Revolution, the moment when machines took over physical labor and, rather than causing permanent unemployment, freed human beings to develop entirely new categories of work that no one had anticipated. Perhaps you are telling yourself that this is simply the next version of the same story, that AI will eliminate certain categories of cognitive labor while simultaneously creating new forms of human contribution that we cannot yet imagine. This is the most commonly offered reassurance, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. History does show that technological revolutions have repeatedly displaced workers while ultimately expanding total employment through the creation of new industries and new forms of value. The weavers displaced by the mechanical loom did not permanently unemploy the human race. The accountants displaced by the spreadsheet did not create a permanent army of surplus accountants. New work emerged, as it always has. But here is what is different this time, and why the historical parallel, while comforting, is ultimately insufficient as a response to what is actually coming. Every previous technological revolution automated a specific category of human capability. The mechanical loom automated physical weaving. The steam engine automated physical power. The calculator automated arithmetic. The computer automated certain forms of data processing and storage. In each case, the automation of one specific capability freed human labor to move into other areas where human general intelligence, creativity, and adaptability remained superior to the machine. Artificial general intelligence does not automate one specific capability. It automates the meta-capability, the general ability to learn, reason, adapt, and apply intelligence across domains. When you automate the specific capability, human beings migrate to other domains. But when you automate the general capacity to perform across domains, where exactly do human beings migrate to? This is the question that the historical reassurance does not answer. And it is the question that the most honest researchers, the ones not employed by AI companies with a financial interest in maintaining optimism about the transition, are increasingly struggling to answer with confidence. There is a version of the future where human beings find new forms of contribution that remain valuable precisely because they are human, because they emerge from embodied experience, from emotional connection, from the specific texture of a consciousness that has suffered and loved and lost and hoped. There is a version where the things that make human interaction irreplaceable, the warmth of genuine presence, the wisdom earned through personal suffering, the creativity that emerges from the specific intersection of a unique biography and a unique nervous system, retain economic and social value even as cognitive labor is increasingly automated. But there is another version, a version that the honest application of economic logic makes difficult to dismiss. A version where the combination of AI capability and economic incentive pushes almost all measurable cognitive work toward automation. Not because human beings become less capable, but because the differential between human performance and AI performance becomes so large, and the cost differential so vast that the human contribution becomes economically invisible. Not worthless in any deep human sense, not without dignity or meaning, but invisible in the way that a craftsman hand-stitching shoes is invisible in an economy where a machine can produce 10,000 pairs in the time it takes the craftsman to complete one. And if you think this version is too extreme, too pessimistic, too unlikely to take seriously, I want you to consider one specific data point that should make you pause before you dismiss it. The CEOs of the most advanced AI companies in the world, the people with the most direct access to the actual capabilities of systems currently in development, the people whose entire professional identity is built around optimism about AI's positive potential, have in recent years been saying privately, and increasingly publicly, things that would have been considered alarmist paranoia from a philosopher 5 years ago. They are discussing timelines. They are discussing transitions. They are discussing the need for entirely new social and economic frameworks to manage what is coming. They are not doing this because they are pessimists. They are doing this because they are looking at the same trajectories you now understand, and they are following them honestly to where they lead. Now, I want to pause here and ask you something directly. When you imagine the world in 2030, 5 years from now, what role do you see yourself playing in it? Not the role you hope to play. Not the role you are currently working toward based on assumptions about the future that you formed 5 or 10 years ago when the landscape looked different. But the role you would actually occupy if the trends currently visible in AI development continue at roughly their current pace, or faster. If your honest answer to that question produces discomfort, I want you to know that the discomfort is appropriate. It is not paranoia. It is not catastrophism. It is the natural response of an intelligent mind that is allowing itself to process reality without the protective filter of wishful thinking. And this discomfort, if you are willing to sit with it rather than immediately reaching for reassurance, is actually one of the most valuable things you can feel right now. Because the gap between where you are sitting emotionally and where you need to be psychologically prepared to be is a gap that only becomes more dangerous the longer you refuse to acknowledge it. But I also want to be honest with you about something else. The picture I have been painting, while accurate in its broad outlines, is not the complete picture. Because while it is true that 2030 represents a threshold beyond which the landscape of human cognitive labor will look radically different, it is also true that the transition will not be uniformly devastating. and it will not affect every human being in the same way or at the same speed. The people who will be most protected in the transition are not necessarily the most intelligent, or the most technically skilled, or the most highly educated in the traditional sense. They are the people who understand what is actually happening clearly enough and early enough to reorganize their relationship to their own skills and their own value before the reorganization is imposed on them by circumstances. What does this reorganization look like in practice? It begins with a recognition that most of the skills currently valued in the knowledge economy are valuable primarily because of their scarcity in human beings, and that scarcity is about to become dramatically less relevant. The lawyer's value has historically come from the fact that legal knowledge is difficult to acquire, difficult to apply correctly, and difficult to access without years of expensive training. When AI systems make high-quality legal knowledge instantly accessible to anyone, the scarcity that created legal professionals' market value disappears. The value does not disappear, but the location of it moves. This pattern repeats across almost every professional domain. The skills that will retain value through the transition are not the skills of possessing specialized knowledge. Possessing knowledge is precisely what AI does best. The skills that will retain value, at least in the medium term, are skills that emerge from the specifically human aspects of existence. The ability to build genuine trust with another person. Not performed trust, not efficient trust, but the kind of slow, vulnerable, authentic trust that forms between human beings who have faced uncertainty together. The ability to exercise judgment in genuinely novel situations where no training data exists, situations so new and so specific that even the most sophisticated AI system lacks the contextual grounding to navigate them confidently. The ability to provide meaning, not information, not analysis, but the felt sense of significance that only another conscious being can provide to someone who is suffering or grieving or making a decision whose weight cannot be captured in data. These are not small or unimportant things, but they are also not, in their current form, the foundations of most people's professional identities. Most people's careers are built on expertise, on specialized knowledge, on the efficient application of trained cognitive skills, and it is precisely this foundation that is most directly threatened by what is coming by 2030. This creates an urgency that most people are not yet feeling, because most people are still operating on timelines calibrated to a world where major transitions take decades rather than years. But the timeline has compressed in ways that should be alarming, and the fact that it does not yet feel alarming to most people is itself one of the most dangerous features of this particular moment in history. We have a cognitive tendency to underestimate gradual change until it reaches a threshold that makes it impossible to ignore. Climate scientists call this the boiling frog problem. You can change the temperature of the water slowly enough that the organism inside never registers the need to escape until the moment when escape is no longer possible. The same cognitive limitation that makes it difficult for societies to respond adequately to slow-moving environmental change makes it difficult for individuals to respond adequately to exponential technological change, because exponential change feels slow during most of its trajectory and then suddenly, overwhelmingly fast at precisely the moment when the accumulated momentum becomes visible. We are approaching that moment of visible momentum now. And 2030 is the point, based on the most careful available projections, where the momentum will become impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss with historical reassurance, and impossible to navigate without having thought about it in advance. So what do you actually do with this information? How do you respond to a challenge this large, this fast-moving, and this unprecedented in human history? The first thing you do is resist the twin temptations that this kind of information tends to trigger. The first temptation is denial, the urgent search for reasons why this time is not actually different, why the historical pattern will hold, why the experts warning about disruption are simply being dramatic. The second temptation is despair, the collapse into fatalism, the conclusion that because the transition is large and fast, there is nothing meaningful you can do to prepare for or navigate through it. Both of these responses are understandable. Both are psychologically coherent reactions to genuinely frightening information. And both are, in different ways, forms of the same fundamental error. They are responses that prioritize comfort over accuracy, and in doing so, They eliminate the possibility of intelligent, proactive adaptation. The second thing you do is take the timeline seriously, not as an abstract future event, but as a constraint that should be actively reshaping your decisions right now, today, about what to learn, what to build, where to invest your time and energy and attention. Because the person who begins building psychological resilience, developing genuinely human skills, cultivating community and adaptability, and the specific capabilities that AI systems cannot replicate, in 2025 will be in an enormously different position in 2030 than the person who spends the next 5 years assuming that the trajectory will somehow bend before it reaches them. The third thing you do, and this may be the most important thing of all, is begin to separate your sense of identity and worth from the specific cognitive skills and professional credentials that the AI transition will most directly threaten. This is psychologically the hardest part, because for most educated people in the modern world, professional identity is not a surface feature of who they are. It is deeply structural. The lawyer does not simply have a job as a lawyer. They have organized their sense of self, their sense of purpose, their relationships, their daily rhythms, their ambitions around being a lawyer. When you tell someone that what they have built their identity around is becoming economically obsolete, you are not telling them that their job is at risk. You are threatening the narrative through which they understand their own existence. This is why the psychological preparation for what is coming in 2030 is inseparable from the practical preparation. You cannot adapt your behavior effectively while clinging to an identity that the behavior was designed to protect. You need to find a relationship with yourself, with your own worth and dignity and meaning, that does not depend entirely on your current professional value, because that professional value is about to be tested in ways that no amount of additional training within your current domain will fully protect you from. And this is, in the end, what the year 2030 actually represents. Not simply an economic disruption, not simply a technological threshold, but an invitation extended to every human being alive right now to examine seriously and honestly the question of what we are beyond our usefulness. To ask what remains of human dignity and human meaning when the specific cognitive tasks that we have historically used to define our contribution to the world become the province of systems that are faster, cheaper, and in many measurable respects more capable than we are. This is not a comfortable question. It is not a question with a reassuring, pre-packaged answer. It is the kind of question that entire philosophical and spiritual traditions have spent centuries circling, arriving at partial answers that provide some comfort without fully resolving the underlying tension. But it is a question that our generation is now being forced to confront, not in the abstract luxury of philosophical reflection, but in the immediate, practical context of lives and careers and families and institutions that need to function in a world that is changing at a speed our cognitive architecture was never designed to process. There is a version of what comes after 2030 that is genuinely, profoundly better than what we have now. A version where the automation of cognitive labor frees human beings to pursue meaning, connection, creativity, and care in ways that the relentless economic pressure of competitive labor markets has always constrained. A version where the things that make human life actually worth living, love, curiosity, beauty, community, the experience of consciousness itself in all its richness and complexity, are no longer crowded out by the exhausting necessity of performing cognitive tasks to earn the right to exist. A version where what it means to be human is finally disentangled from what it means to be economically productive, and where that disentanglement is experienced not as a loss but as a liberation. But that version of the future does not arrive automatically. It does not emerge simply from the development of more capable AI systems. It requires a simultaneous transformation in how we organize society, distribute resources, define value, and understand the relationship between human beings and the tools they create. It requires a level of collective wisdom, political courage, and philosophical clarity that human civilization has not yet consistently demonstrated. And whether we arrive at that better version, or at a darker version where the benefits of AI automation accumulate at the top of already steep hierarchies, while the disruption falls most heavily on the people with the least capacity to absorb it, will depend more than anything else on whether enough human beings begin grappling honestly with what is coming early enough to shape the transition, rather than simply endure it. You're watching this video at a moment when that grappling is still possible. When the transition is far enough from completion that the choices made now, individually and collectively, still have the capacity to influence its direction. 5 years is not much time, but it is time. And what you do with it, how clearly you see what is coming, how honestly you reckon with its implications, how deliberately you begin building the psychological and practical foundations for navigating a world organized around genuinely different principles than the world you were prepared for, will determine whether you are among the people who experience 2030 as a threshold crossed consciously, and with some degree of agency, or among the people who experience it as something that happened to them while they were looking the other way. The question I leave you with is not about artificial intelligence. It is about you. What is the story you tell yourself about your own value, your own purpose, your own place in the world, and how much of that story depends on assumptions about the future that may no longer be accurate? Are you willing to examine that story honestly before 2030 does it for you? Because that examination, however uncomfortable, is the beginning of the only kind of preparation that actually matters.